When I developed the experimental method to study atmospheric pressure in the mountains of Puy-de-Dôme, measuring mercury columns at different altitudes and calculating probabilities of various outcomes, I never imagined this same rigorous approach would become my most powerful tool for demonstrating the truth of Christianity. While my contemporaries argued that faith and science occupied separate realms, Descartes insisting on methodological doubt while the Church demanded blind acceptance, I discovered through careful observation and logical analysis that the scientific method, when properly applied, leads directly to Christian truth, not away from it. The same intellectual honesty that compelled me to reject Aristotelian physics in favor of experimental evidence compelled me to examine Christianity with mathematical precision. Today, I want to share with you the empirical approach that transformed my understanding and proved, through measurable evidence and logical probability calculations, that Christianity represents the most rational conclusion an honest scientist can reach when examining the complete data set of human existence and natural reality. Chapter 1: The Laboratory of Human Experience, Testing Christianity Like Any Scientific Hypothesis. Every valid scientific inquiry begins with careful observation of phenomena that demand explanation, followed by hypothesis formation and rigorous testing. In my laboratory, I observed that mercury rose precisely 760 millimeters in my barometer under standard atmospheric conditions, a measurable, repeatable fact that demanded investigation and ultimately overturned centuries of accepted theory about nature's supposed horror of vacuums. The intellectual courage required to accept experimental evidence over traditional authority transformed my understanding of natural philosophy. Similarly, when I turned this same analytical gaze toward human existence, I observed phenomena equally demanding of scientific explanation: the universal human experience of moral conscience that transcends cultural conditioning, the consistent longing for infinite meaning in demonstrably finite beings, the remarkable capacity for both abstract reasoning and self-sacrificial love that distinguishes humans from mere matter in motion, and the persistent sense of incompleteness that drives humans seeking despite material satisfaction. These observations cannot be dismissed as merely subjective impressions. They represent consistent, measurable patterns across cultures, centuries, and individual biographies. Just as I documented atmospheric pressure variations with mathematical precision, recording measurements at different altitudes and weather conditions, I began documenting the spiritual pressures and moral patterns that manifest consistently in human behavior regardless of education, wealth, or social position. The scientific method requires us to formulate hypotheses that best explain observed data, then test these hypotheses against additional evidence while remaining open to falsification. When I applied this approach systematically to competing worldviews, materialism, pantheism, deism, and Christianity, examining their explanatory power for the complete range of human experience, Christianity emerged as the hypothesis that best accounts for all the data without requiring us to ignore inconvenient observations. Materialism fails catastrophically to account for consciousness, mathematical knowledge, moral intuition, and the existence of love as anything more than chemical reactions. Pantheism cannot explain the stark reality of evil, the meaningful distinction between moral and immoral choices, or individual human responsibility. Deism leaves us with a distant, impersonal deity incapable of relationship or redemption. Only Christianity provides a comprehensive framework that explains both human dignity and human depravity, both our capacity for transcendent truth and our persistent moral failures, both the mathematical elegance of natural law and the personal meaning we discover in existence. The same intellectual honesty that led me to accept atmospheric pressure measurements despite their contradiction of Aristotelian physics compelled me to accept Christian truth despite its contradiction of the fashionable skepticism prevalent in Parisian intellectual circles of my era. Chapter 2: Probabilistic Proof, Calculating the Odds of Design in Nature and History. My collaboration with Fermat in establishing the mathematical foundations of probability theory taught me to calculate expected values and assess rational decisions under conditions of uncertainty. These principles proved essential for evaluating evidence in gambling, insurance, and investment, areas where incomplete information requires careful analysis of risk and potential outcomes. When I applied these same mathematical principles to evaluate the evidence for divine design in nature and supernatural intervention in history, the probabilistic calculations proved overwhelming in favor of theistic explanations. Consider the probability calculations involved in the emergence of life itself from non-living matter, the precise values required for fundamental physical constants, the extraordinary fine-tuning of natural laws that permit stable stars and planets, the information content embedded in even the simplest biological systems, and the coordination required between multiple complex systems for life to exist. Each of these factors individually represents an extraordinarily improbable outcome if attributed to random processes. The probability that undirected material forces could generate the integrated complexity we observe in living cells approaches mathematical impossibility, comparable to calculating the odds that randomly scattered letters would arrange themselves into a complete encyclopedia through wind action alone. Just as I calculated that certain gambling strategies were irrational despite appearing profitable to inexperienced players, I discovered that atheistic explanations for biological complexity require accepting odds so astronomical that no reasonable person would wager on them in any other practical context. My experiments with the cycloid curve and investigations into conic sections demonstrated how mathematical laws govern natural phenomena with extraordinary precision and elegant simplicity. When extended to biological and cosmological observations, this same mathematical precision suggests an intelligent source of natural law rather than mindless material processes operating by accident. The mathematical elegance underlying physical reality, from the numerical patterns in my triangle arithmetic to gravitational calculations, points consistently toward a mind that thinks mathematically, not toward random material interactions. Furthermore, probability theory reveals that while isolated instances of apparent design might conceivably result from chance coincidence, the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence creates cumulative probabilities that exceed any reasonable standard of doubt. The anthropic principle in cosmology, biological information content, mathematical beauty in natural law, moral intuition in human consciousness, and historical evidence for miraculous intervention represent independent data streams, each pointing toward the same theistic conclusion. When calculated properly using principles I developed for assessing games of chance, honest probability assessment applied with mathematical rigor demonstrates that theistic belief represents the rational choice based on evidence, while atheism requires faith in extraordinarily improbable scenarios that would be rejected immediately in any other scientific context. The mathematics of probability, when honestly applied to questions of ultimate reality, supports rather than undermines Christian faith. Chapter 3: The Experimental Test of Prayer and Spiritual Experience, Verifying Christian Claims Through Direct Observation. Scientific method depends not merely on theoretical calculation and logical deduction but on experimental verification through controlled observation of predicted outcomes. Hypotheses, regardless of their logical elegance, must be tested against actual experience to determine their correspondence with reality. This fundamental principle led me to develop the most crucial experiment of my intellectual life, testing whether Christian spiritual claims could be verified through direct personal experience, following biblical instructions with the same methodological rigor I applied to my physical experiments with vacuums and atmospheric pressure. Jesus Christ himself provided the experimental protocol in remarkably clear terms. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. This represents a perfectly falsifiable hypothesis in scientific terms. If sincere seeking following prescribed methods does not produce authentic spiritual knowledge and transformation, Christianity fails the empirical test decisively. However, if genuine prayer, careful scripture study, and moral obedience consistently produce spiritual insight and character transformation, this constitutes positive experimental evidence supporting Christian truth claims. I conducted this experiment with complete intellectual honesty, maintaining careful observational records of results over extended periods. The data proved remarkable and consistently reproducible. Prayer produced measurable changes in emotional equilibrium, intellectual perspective, and moral courage that exceeded my natural psychological capabilities. Scripture study yielded practical insights that illuminated both human nature and wisdom for living that proved superior to philosophical alternatives I had studied extensively. Most significantly, participation in Christian community provided direct observational evidence of supernatural transformation in ordinary people from various social backgrounds and educational levels. I witnessed consistent patterns of character change, sacrificial love, and peace under difficult circumstances that could not be explained adequately through purely natural psychological or social mechanisms. These experimental results proved repeatable, observable by independent witnesses, and produced testable predictions about behavior and decision-making that could be verified in daily life. When I applied Christian principles systematically to relationships, work responsibilities, and moral choices, the outcomes consistently exceeded what my previous philosophical frameworks had achieved in terms of both personal satisfaction and positive impact on others. Critics might object that spiritual experience cannot be quantified with the same precision as atmospheric pressure measurements, but this objection confuses measurement precision with evidential validity. We routinely accept witness testimony in legal proceedings, historical documentation in academic research, and subjective reports in medical diagnosis, all forms of evidence that involve less precision than laboratory measurements yet provide reliable information for practical decisions. The experimental verification of Christian spiritual claims, conducted with appropriate controls and honest documentation, provides empirical support for Christianity's truth that meets legitimate scientific standards when properly understood. Chapter 4: The Convergence of Evidence, Multiple Independent Lines of Confirmation Supporting Christian Truth. The most powerful and convincing scientific arguments combine multiple independent lines of evidence that converge on the same conclusion from different methodological approaches. My atmospheric pressure experiments gained scientific credibility not from a single measurement taken under one set of conditions, but from consistent results obtained at different altitudes, varying weather conditions, diverse geographical locations, and using different experimental apparatus. Similarly, Christianity's truth claims are supported by converging evidence from philosophy, history, archaeology, science, psychology, and personal experience, each providing independent confirmation that strengthens the cumulative case. Historical evidence demonstrates through standard historiographical methods that Jesus of Nazareth lived as a historical figure, died by crucifixion under Roman authority, and was proclaimed risen from the dead by witnesses willing to suffer severe persecution and martyrdom for their testimony. The historical reliability of this evidence exceeds that available for most other ancient historical claims that historians accept routinely. Archaeological findings consistently confirm biblical historical claims rather than contradicting them, with discoveries regularly vindicating biblical accuracy against previous scholarly skepticism. Manuscript evidence for New Testament documents exceeds that available for any other ancient literature by enormous margins. We possess thousands of early copies spanning multiple geographical regions and language groups, allowing for precise textual reconstruction with extraordinarily high confidence levels. This textual reliability provides a solid foundation for evaluating the content of Christian claims rather than dismissing them due to uncertain transmission. Philosophical analysis reveals Christianity's unique capacity to resolve fundamental questions about consciousness, moral obligation, ultimate meaning, and human dignity that competing worldviews cannot adequately address without internal contradictions or arbitrary assumptions. The problem of evil, often cited as evidence against Christianity, actually supports Christian anthropology's diagnosis of human moral corruption better than alternative systems that struggle to explain why beings supposedly evolved for survival would develop ethical intuitions that frequently contradict survival interests. Scientific discoveries increasingly reveal the fine-tuning and information content of natural systems that point toward intelligent causation rather than random material processes. The mathematical elegance of physical laws, the anthropic constants required for life, and the digital information encoded in DNA all provide positive evidence for design that cannot be dismissed through appeals to infinite parallel universes or other speculative mechanisms. Personal testimony from transformed lives across cultures, centuries, and social circumstances provides experiential evidence that Christian claims about spiritual rebirth, moral empowerment, and divine relationship produce observable results in human behavior and community life. The consistency and quality of this testimony suggests underlying spiritual reality rather than mere psychological delusion or social conditioning. When I calculated the probability using my mathematical methods that all these independent lines of evidence would converge accidentally on Christianity if it were actually false, the odds became vanishingly small, approaching the mathematical impossibility that characterizes miracle claims. Just as multiple experimental confirmations establish scientific theories beyond reasonable doubt, multiple evidential confirmations establish Christianity's truth claims with confidence that exceeds most beliefs we hold with complete certainty in practical life. Chapter 5: Falsifiability and the Honest Assessment of Counter-Evidence, Testing Christianity Against Its Critics. Genuine scientific thinking requires subjecting our hypotheses to potential falsification and honestly assessing contrary evidence with the same rigor we apply to supporting data. Theories that cannot conceivably be proven wrong lie outside the realm of empirical investigation and deserve skepticism regardless of their emotional appeal. Christianity, unlike many philosophical systems and religious traditions, makes specific historical and experiential claims that could theoretically be disproven through archaeological discovery, historical research, or failure of spiritual promises. This falsifiability actually strengthens rather than weakens Christianity's scientific credibility by making it amenable to empirical testing. I examined every significant objection to Christian truth with the same analytical rigor I applied to critiques of my mathematical proofs and physical experiments. The problem of evil, apparent conflicts between faith and scientific reason, historical challenges to biblical accounts, philosophical objections to supernatural claims, and psychological explanations for religious experience all received careful consideration using consistent logical standards. However, honest analysis revealed that these challenges, while requiring thoughtful responses and continued investigation, do not constitute decisive counter-evidence when evaluated fairly. The problem of evil, rather than undermining Christianity, actually supports Christian anthropology's realistic assessment of human moral corruption and need for redemption better than optimistic alternatives that struggle to explain persistent selfishness, cruelty, and injustice in human societies. If humans were merely highly evolved animals without fallen spiritual nature, we would expect moral behavior to correlate with survival advantage, yet we consistently observe ethical intuitions that contradict self-interest and tribal loyalty. Apparent conflicts between faith and scientific reason typically dissolve under careful analysis when both domains are properly understood in their appropriate spheres and methods. Science investigates the mechanisms of natural phenomena while religion addresses questions of ultimate meaning, moral obligation, and personal relationship with divine reality. These represent complementary rather than contradictory approaches to understanding reality in its fullness. Historical challenges to biblical accounts consistently weaken under improved archaeological investigation and better understanding of ancient Near Eastern historical contexts. Skeptical theories about Christian origins that were popular in previous centuries have been abandoned by serious scholars as new evidence has emerged confirming rather than contradicting biblical historical claims. Philosophical objections usually target oversimplified or straw-man versions of Christian doctrine rather than the sophisticated theological formulations developed through centuries of intellectual refinement by thinkers of the caliber of Augustine, Aquinas, and other great minds who combined rigorous philosophical training with deep spiritual insight. Most importantly, I discovered that alternative worldviews face far more serious evidential problems than Christianity while providing significantly less explanatory power for the full range of human experience and natural phenomena we actually observe. Chapter 6: The Predictive Power of Christian Truth Claims, Testing Christianity's Accuracy about Reality. Scientific theories gain credibility and acceptance through their ability to make accurate predictions about previously unobserved phenomena, allowing for prospective testing rather than merely retroactive explanation of known facts. Einstein's general relativity gained widespread acceptance partly because it predicted gravitational lensing effects and precise orbital mechanics that were later confirmed through astronomical observation. Similarly, Christianity makes specific, testable predictions about human nature, historical patterns, and personal experience that can be evaluated against real-world outcomes using empirical methods. Christian anthropology predicts that human beings will consistently demonstrate both noble moral capacities and persistent moral corruption, explaining both heroic self-sacrifice and shocking evil within the same societies and even the same individuals. This prediction proves remarkably accurate when tested against historical evidence, psychological research, and personal observation. Competing worldviews struggle to account for this moral complexity. Materialism cannot explain genuine altruism, while romantic optimism cannot account for persistent human selfishness despite education and social progress. Christianity predicts that attempts to create perfect societies through human effort alone will ultimately fail due to unchanged human nature, regardless of political systems, economic arrangements, or technological advances. This prediction has been tragically confirmed by utopian political movements throughout history, from French Revolutionary Terror through Nazi racial ideology to communist attempts at creating new socialist humanity. The consistent failure of purely secular redemption projects supports Christian diagnosis of human spiritual problems requiring divine intervention. Biblical teaching predicts that material prosperity alone will not satisfy fundamental human longing for meaning and purpose, that guilt requires genuine forgiveness rather than mere psychological understanding or social acceptance, and that love represents a fundamental aspect of reality rather than an accidental byproduct of evolutionary competition. These predictions prove remarkably accurate when tested against psychological research on happiness, sociological data on social problems in wealthy societies, and personal experience of individuals who achieve conventional success yet remain spiritually empty. Biblical prophecy, when interpreted according to sound hermeneutical principles rather than sensationalistic speculation, demonstrates predictive accuracy regarding the fate of ancient nations, the preservation of Jewish identity through millennia of diaspora, and the global spread of Christian influence despite persistent persecution. While avoiding both skeptical dismissal and naive literalism, honest evaluation reveals patterns of historical fulfillment that exceed mere coincidence or post facto interpretation. Most significantly for practical testing, Christianity predicts that genuine spiritual conversion will produce observable transformation in character, relationships, and life priorities that can be measured through longitudinal studies and community observation. This prediction proves testable through addiction recovery programs, rehabilitation initiatives, and community transformation projects. The consistent positive outcomes in programs incorporating Christian spiritual elements provide empirical support for claims about supernatural regeneration and divine empowerment. The predictive success of Christian truth claims, when evaluated using the same standards of evidence we apply to scientific theories, provides additional confirmation that Christianity corresponds to actual reality rather than representing mere wishful thinking, cultural conditioning, or psychological projection. Chapter 7: The Integration of Faith and Reason, a Unified Scientific Approach to Complete Truth. My greatest intellectual discovery involved recognizing that faith and reason, properly understood according to their true nature and appropriate domains, represent complementary rather than competing approaches to truth about reality. Just as geometric intuition and algebraic calculation both contribute essential elements to complete mathematical understanding, with neither approach alone being sufficient for solving complex problems, spiritual insight and rational analysis both contribute indispensable components to comprehensive knowledge of reality in its full dimensions. The false dichotomy between faith and reason that characterizes much contemporary discussion has hindered both scientific progress and spiritual understanding by creating artificial barriers between different aspects of human knowledge-seeking. True science requires faith in the reliability of logical thinking, the uniformity of natural law, and the correspondence between mathematical models and physical reality, assumptions that cannot themselves be proven scientifically without circular reasoning. Faith, properly understood in the Christian tradition, means trust based on adequate evidence rather than belief maintained despite contrary evidence. When I trust a mathematical theorem, I exercise faith grounded in logical demonstration and mathematical proof. When I trust historical testimony about past events, I exercise faith grounded in documentary evidence and witness credibility. When I trust Christian revelation about spiritual reality, I exercise faith grounded in the convergent evidence we have systematically examined, philosophical reasoning, historical investigation, scientific observation, and personal spiritual experience. Reason alone proves insufficient for complete understanding because finite human minds cannot comprehend infinite reality through unaided rational analysis. Mathematical proofs ultimately depend on unprovable axioms. Scientific theories require faith in assumptions about natural law that cannot be empirically verified. Even logical thinking presupposes the reliability of logical principles that cannot be proven through logic without circularity. Pure rationalism leads inevitably to skeptical paralysis, while pure empiricism cannot account for the mathematical foundations that make science possible. Christianity provides the metaphysical framework within which both reason and faith find their proper roles, appropriate limitations, and ultimate unity in the pursuit of truth. Reason serves as an essential tool for understanding natural revelation manifest in creation and for testing spiritual claims against evidence and logical consistency. Faith enables trust in divine revelation that transcends but does not contradict rational analysis, providing access to spiritual dimensions of reality unavailable through purely natural investigation. This integration of faith and reason explains why the greatest scientists throughout history, from Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton to Louis Pasteur and Gregor Mendel, found their scientific work enhanced rather than hindered by deep Christian faith. Far from opposing legitimate scientific investigation, Christianity provides the metaphysical foundation that makes science possible by affirming the rational intelligibility of creation and the reliability of human cognitive abilities as gifts from a rational creator. When faith and reason are properly integrated rather than artificially separated, they produce a more complete and satisfying understanding of reality than either approach can achieve alone, enabling us to embrace both the mathematical elegance of natural law and the personal meaning discovered through spiritual relationship with our Creator. Conclusion. Through systematic application of the same empirical methods that established the reality of atmospheric pressure and the mathematical foundations of probability theory, I have discovered that Christianity represents the most scientifically credible worldview available to honest investigators willing to follow evidence wherever it leads. The convergent evidence from multiple independent sources, the superior explanatory power for the complete range of human experience and natural phenomena, the predictive accuracy of Christian truth claims about human nature and historical patterns, and the experimental verification of spiritual promises through personal experience all point consistently toward the same conclusion. The gospel of Jesus Christ represents objective reality rather than subjective wishful thinking or cultural conditioning. This discovery should encourage rather than threaten genuine scientific inquiry and intellectual honesty. If Christianity is true, then investigating God's creation with rigorous empirical methods honors the divine intelligence that designed natural laws with mathematical precision and created human minds capable of discovering truth. If human beings are created in God's image rather than being merely highly evolved animals, then our capacity for logical thought, mathematical insight, and empirical investigation reflects divine attributes rather than accidental byproducts of mindless evolutionary processes. The same intellectual curiosity and commitment to truth that drives legitimate scientific research should naturally extend to honest investigation of Christianity's truth claims using identical standards of evidence, logical analysis, and experimental verification. I challenge you to conduct your own careful empirical investigation of Christian truth with the same intellectual honesty and methodological rigor you would apply to any important scientific hypothesis. The evidence, when fairly evaluated, will lead you to the same life-transforming conclusion that revolutionized my own understanding and continues to guide my pursuit of truth in all its dimensions.